Hey, Scott Radigan here from Functional Lawyer, and today I want to help you decide how you're going to expand your practice or reevaluate how your practice is set up right now so that you can avoid committing crimes and going to jail potentially. Now, I'm not here to scare you, but you should know when you're sitting down to conduct your risk analysis what the potential risks actually are, and not just because so and so is doing it or you think that it should be the way you want it to be. Unfortunately, that's not how the world we live in, but let's find out what the actual limitations and rules are. That way you can work within them, or you can, kind of play in the areas that are not catching up to industry's speed. So, um, as a reminder, when it comes to telemedicine specifically, industry, that's the practitioners, are far outpacing the regulators. In other words, they haven't made laws to catch up with the advancement of technology and the proliferation, especially in the last 16 months of telemedicine. So today we're going to talk about what is the practice of medicine. So people that are considering consulting or coaching can understand what their limitations are. Last week we talked about health coaches scope. So I recommend you go back and look at that as well. But this week we'll focus on the practice of medicine itself. We'll look at the definition of telemedicine and where most people get into trouble when they go to practice across state lines. So we are going to examine a couple of example states. So in Maryland, to practice medicine is defined twice. It means to engage with or without compensation in medical diagnosis, healing, treatment, or surgery. Notice it doesn't say anything before we move on about prescription drugs or conventional medicine. None of that's in there. So I get a lot of either misinformation or just misunderstandings where people say, well, I'm not going to be prescribing drugs, so I won't be practicing medicine. Um, Not the same thing, as you can see by the definition. It doesn't talk about prescription drugs at all. And in fact, this second part will kind of further enhance that. So practice medicine also includes doing, undertaking, professing to do, and attempting any of the following: diagnosing, healing, treating, preventing, prescribing for, or removing any physical, mental, or emotional ailment or supposed ailment of an individual by physical, mental, emotional, or other process that is exercised or invoked by the practitioner, the patient, or both, or by appliance, test, drug, operation, or treatment. So that is a very, very inclusive definition of the practice of medicine in Maryland, and that how that actually is interpreted and enforced by the Board of Medicine in Maryland is not our focus today, but it's very broadly written through a statute. That is a statute, a state statute. It's not a board rule or regulation. So it's very broad in Maryland. There's a couple of other subsets of practice medicine as well that don't really apply to us today. But as you can see, the big takeaways here are, you don't need to be paid. So if it's free, it still counts. And it's not just prescription. It's not just tests. It's not just appliances or equipment-based treatments. It's very open, and a lot of states have similar language, or they're not as open, but they're just worded vaguely. So it's up to the board's interpretation to determine. And so I've seen most states have something like this. They usually don't add this to I as explicitly as this state statute does. But when you kind of read the legislative intent and some of the notes around it and some of the decisions coming out of it, it's clear that it's not just prescription drugs or conventional care that we have been taught for 30 years or 40 or 50 years. Maybe before that, we did a little bit more lifestyle. But what we're used to in the conventional world is not the only definition of medicine. That's just one definition. So I think I've hammered on that a couple of times now. So with that said, we know what medicine is, but then what's telemedicine? It varies by state, but same thing, just medicine we saw the definition above, just using remote means, and typically phone and fax are carved out of the definition of telemedicine. And I think my interpretation is that they carved those out because they didn't want traditional brick and mortar practices to have to deal with telemedicine laws when they are just calling patients or faxing records back and forth. So there's that. So that is, it's effectively the same in every state, definition of medicine, and then using remote means. They have slightly different wording, but we'll stay in Maryland for this example and then go to North Carolina as well. So in Maryland, telehealth means a mode of delivering healthcare services through telecommunications by a healthcare practitioner to a patient at a different physical location. Includes synchronous and asynchronous. So synchronous means real time. Asynchronous, often called store and forward, would be anything from portal messages to interpreting lab tests that maybe is not in a live interaction, that you send a message or you get the lab results, you do it, and then you send the results. That's what asynchronous is, not real time. And then here's the carve out too. Does not include audio only calls, although some states are now including audio only in their telemedicine definition. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the laws are just evolving, particularly in telemedicine and telemedicine's definition and the licensure of it. So Maryland, at least as of last fall, does not include audio only in its telehealth laws, but be careful with your own state to know whether that is true or not. Okay, so that's what telehealth means in Maryland. In North Carolina, just a little bit south, telemedicine is the practice of medicine, which is defined elsewhere in North Carolina's rules and statutes, that using electronic communication between a licensee in one place and a patient in the other, with or without an intervening healthcare provider, meaning sometimes there are two providers that are involved in the call, but that's not relevant for us today. So in North Carolina, telemedicine and telehealth are kind of one in the same. Most states kind of use them interchangeably. So whereas North Carolina uses telemedicine as its kind of defined term, other states will call it telehealth, but they're talking about the exact same thing. So that's a little bit frustrating and confusing for the lay person out there. So just Google your state telemedicine laws and you'll be able to read it word for word. So that's what telemedicine is. Telemedicine is located where the patient is, right? You should all know that at this point in the pandemic, that when you're doing telemedicine, especially across state lines, you are practicing medicine where the patient is located. It's also true in your state, but it's not a problem because you're licensed in your state. And so long as you're following the standard of care and the rules around establishing care and maintaining care virtually in your state, then there's no issue. But if you're practicing out of your state, the patient in this example is in North Carolina, you are not, and you're not licensed there, then you're practicing there without a license, which means here is bad example. So we flip back to Maryland now, but if we go back to Maryland, it is a person practicing without a license. Here's the penalty. If a person violates 14601 or 14602, you are guilty of a felony and on conviction is subject to a fine of up to $10,000 and up to 5 years in prison or both. And you can be subject to a fine of up to $50,000 as well. So it could cost you $60,000, 5 years of your life, and will probably come with some license action in your home state, wherever you're licensed as well. So that's why I tend to be a little bit of a conservative voice on this front. I really just don't want anybody that is listening to me, that is following me, to be convicted of a felony, and then I have to tell their story for the next 5 to 10 years and say, no, it really does happen. This is what happened to a person in my orbit not too long ago, and this is why we are conservative with what we do. Because you went to med school, or you went to your medical training, your practitioner training, and you probably spent a good amount of money. But then after that, you went and studied, additionally, after you were done with residency or your training program, you came out, you started working, but then you also took extra credits doing functional or integrative or anti-aging medicine, and you spent a bunch of money on that, and then to just kind of throw it all away because you're not really either aware of the rules or aware of the risks. That I just don't want to see you doing that. Now that you're aware of the definitions, the potential penalties, now you can make a better informed choice about what your risk tolerance is for your situation. I don't want to push my risk tolerance onto you. I tend to skew a little bit more conservative. There are other options, though, to expand your practice or expand your reach outside of your home state. But practicing medicine, unless you're licensed there, should not be one of them, or it is against the law. And so you'll have to be aware of that. If you have questions about the practice of medicine, interstate medical licensing laws or compacts, whether you are an MD or a health coach or anyone in between, please reach out to us at Functional Lawyer, or just subscribe here and share this with your friends that need to have this information as well. I'm Scott Radigan, and we'll see you guys next time.